This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern. Every week we bring you conversations with authors about their books and research and other things that we like. And if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage. That's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us. Some of you have been doing this for months and years, and we cannot thank you enough. My guest today is the Deputy Director General for Strategy and Planning at the Jewish Agency. He holds a PhD in political philosophy from Oxford University and was previously a research fellow at the Van Leeuw Jerusalem Institute and New York University. His book, Judaism and Liberalism, A Metaphysical Tale of Two Siblings, was published last year in Hebrew by Yediot Acharonot Press. Dr. Shivi Greenfield, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hi, great being here.
So the crux of your argument is that not only are Judaism and liberalism not mutually exclusive, which is an argument that has been made occasionally, it's more than that. They actually stem from the same metaphysical source. Please explain.
Yeah, so I think the analogy to describe how usually the relationship between liberalism and Judaism is portrayed is like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Okay, so we know Israeli-Palestinian conflict is two entities, and the question, two entities that have some kind of hostility between them, tension, however we describe it. And the question is, to what extent, if at all, they can live together? So some would say, status quo where they manage to live together is a reasonable outcome, and some others say, no, it's a battle to death. And that many times, that's usually how even kind of in a certain kind of the default assumption is that we can try to live together. And my claim is that there's some kind of a deep misunderstanding here, because it's not that if these are two different, not only incompatible, but even competing conceptions. They're very different concepts historically, culturally, many, many different differences between them. But metaphysically, when we ask about not the historical origins, but the moral, the principle, this kind of the notion, the principles that lead them, they're very, very similar. Similar is even an understatement how remarkable the similarities are, given that one of them, was born in Judea, 2,000 years ago, and the other in Europe, 1,500 years later. So the argument is that when we ask ourselves, what are the origins of these ideas? Liberalism, we know the story very well. Liberalism was born out of a revolt against the old system, the cosmic order, the idea that there's a world that you can't control, that there's something above you in the political arena. Obviously, that was, the right of kings to rule, and so on. If you're born as a peasant, you were born a nobleman. That's your destiny. That's what you're supposed to be born into, and no questions about it. And suddenly came this kind of notion that no, the individuals can be the authors of their life, are the center, like Kant defined it, the Copernican revolution, putting the human being in the center of the universe. And this story is told, in many different ways. We all know it, how came the Enlightenment and democracy was born first in United States, and then immediately after in France, and then gradually all around the world. A less told story is the very, very similar revolt that took place just before the destruction of the temple. So before the first century.
First or second?
The second, of course.
Second.
Yeah, you're right, the second. And this revolt was no less dramatic in first of all, in its origins and the likelihood of it occurring, and the implication, the consequences. It's a whole drama. And everything happened in the same time. The most traumatic event maybe in the history of the Jews, aside of the Holocaust, the destruction of the temple, happened in parallel. It didn't happen afterwards. So there was this kind of a group of people, we call today Chazal, the sages, okay, who out of the blue suddenly reconstructed or defined a new Judaism altogether that was almost a total critical and maybe the opposite, you would say, of the biblical Judaism. And that is a very similar concept taking place, where this new Judaism centered around the individual. We know that through this famous concept of the image of God. And what I try to say, answering kind of your question, is that the same motivation, as much as you can, as historians don't like, saying, these are same events taking place, so it's I want to put all this in qualify my answer, from a scientific perspective. But when you look at the motivations, the moral, and you ask yourself what drove them, these are very similar motivations. So liberalism and Judaism are not only, I call them siblings. To some extent, they're even kind of twins, born in different generations, but with very, very similar DNA.
To different mothers as well. Yeah.
Not entirely. I wouldn't say that even. I think.
So I want to ask you this. Actually, sorry to cut you off, but it leads me to the next question that I wanted to ask. And that is the liberal revolution and the rabbinical revolution siblings, or is it liberalism and Judaism? Are they really that similar, Judaism and liberalism, or are you really talking about the process that gave birth to them?
Right. So today, when you ask yourself, liberalism, what is liberalism? It's relatively easy to answer what liberalism is. It is not that easy, but it's relatively easy, right? Judaism, it's a much more complicated question. So what is Judaism? The vast majority, at least if you ask Orthodox community today, Judaism is not the biblical Judaism. The irony is that if you go to Haredi, ultra-Orthodox yeshivas, and you ask them, what is Judaism? They'll say, Gemara, the Talmud, right? They don't learn, what they learn from the Bible is just what they read in the Torah portions during, on Shabbat. And that's it. Basically, the prophets, they hardly, unless it is part of the Haftarah read in Shabbat. So Judaism today is not, the Judaism that scholars have, researched in ancient biblical, the 1,200 years between Mount Sinai and the destruction of the temple. It's the Judaism that began from the destruction of the temple. It's the Mishnah, the rabbinical, what we call, and then the Talmud, and so on. So, answering your question, the Judaism as it was formed by the rabbis, by the sages, is definitely a liberal tradition. As much as we can say, using this, acronym of using a modern concept to describe it, but this Judaism is definitely liberal. The ancient one, no, it's the more Plato, kind of more old cosmic order philosophies that we know from many, many cultures, which is not liberal.
So you're talking really the center here is the individual, the image of God, man, as it was called in now it's not so politically correct anymore. But whereas again in liberalism it's pretty clear why the individual, his or her choices, reason, etc., is really what it's all about. In Judaism, there are some mitigating factors like God. Still, at the end of the day, it is the individual, but it is subjected to God. And also in Judaism proper, there's peoplehood. I mean, you are indeed a part of a community, whether you like it or not. So aren't these mitigating factors about the centrality of man? So
actually, the specific concept you just talked about, the peoplehood on the one hand and God at the other, just demonstrate how radical the revolution in Judaism took place, because both of them were very fundamentally challenged. So the old Jewish tradition, the biblical tradition, of course, there's the entity, what we call it in philosophy ontology, what is a people. There are no individuals. Individuals are integral parts of a whole. They don't have any meaning, significance on their own. You're part of a tribe. You're part of an entire people. When God speaks to the people, he doesn't speak to any specific individual. If he speaks to Moses, he speaks him as a convey, as someone who communicates to the entire people, which is the people of Israel, Bnei Israel. Now, what happened is an entire kind of collapse of this system and putting it up on his head. Because what did Chazal say? And this is represented most vividly in the story of the oven of Achnai. Okay, and there are many different ways how the Talmud portrays it, but that's the most kind of, the illustrative way, because the story of these rabbis having a discussion about the most trivial and boring question possible about the laws of purity and about this specific oven constructed in a very bizarre way. Nobody uses any such construction. Just question if it's pure or not. And this suddenly goes, this very mundane and kind of trivial discussion suddenly becomes, very dramatic when one of the rabbis, Rabbi Eliezer, who is very angry that the other rabbis don't agree with his position, says, well, the truth is with me. I demand, if the truth is with me, I expect, I want, let this river, this stream, the water go the opposite way. And they do it. And then and the rabbis, that are arguing with them just, dismiss it. They say, well, that's not a proof for anything. So he says, well, let the walls bend. And the walls bend. And still the rabbis dismiss it. And he says, well, let a voice from God tell. And then comes a voice of God and says, Rabbi Eliezer, has the truth is with him. He got it right. You got it wrong, guys. And the rabbis say to him, no, you missed the entire point. God is out of the picture. God gave us the Torah. With all due respect, we respect the fact that God has said it. But God is like, come on, join in. The majority rules. That's what they say. And what's the response of God? Yeah, God says, I'm full of pride. Okay, he says my children. Okay, and that is one small story, but it tells a revolution taking place where God, and how did they explain it to him? Obviously, this is a metaphysical. Today, if you would say such a thing, it's a heresy is like understatement for how people will react to it. So, thinking about how radical this conception was, what did they say? They said, look, God created the human being, the person, in his image. What does that mean, in his image? Not in a sense that we resemble God in our physical features, but in our capacity to be authoritative, to rule, to establish order, to create, Marx called the human being homo faber, a creator, okay? And God says, this is what you are. And it says in the Psukim in Bereshit and in Genesis, that when it appears in the verses, this concept of the image of God, it says it very clearly that God gave the human being some kind of quality to master the world, to rule the world, the fish and the animals and the land. And Chazal, the sages took it literally, and they said, well, God, you gave us the Torah, you gave us this capacity of reason, now we're executing it, and you might not like the consequences, but you'll respect them. And God says, you're right, I will respect them. And what happened in this revolution that first of all took this concept that God is just equal to us, and he has to be subject to the same principles of reason we are, is that Chazal took this in the second stage. They took this and they defined the ontology of the universe from scratch. They said, what is are not people, but are individuals. And individuals that the entire world was born for each and one of them. And suddenly, and this is where the halacha kicks in, because Chazal, as opposed to Western philosophy, spoke very little about metaphysics and immediately jumped into concrete halachic ruling. So very little. And what did they say? They said, all this ruling that we take today as granted, but this notion of pikuach nefesh, that whatever is a risk to life, over every ruling in the Torah can be, pushed away to save lives. Where did this come from? This notion of the sanctity of the human life of the individual, the entire, even if one person life is never outweighed by the lives of the many, because each and every individual is judged, individually. So these are things that are completely radical when you ask yourself, what was the biblical notion?
What about other forms of such religion? I was thinking, of course, Protestantism, that also consecrates the individual and their own rituals, etc. Is that like a half-sibling to Judaism and liberalism, in your view?
Look, so liberalism was born out of a very religious deep belief. Liberalism is secular to some extent, right? Secular today. But we should remember, the fathers of liberalism, I'd say, the founding fathers, we're all religious people. So, and we're all Protestants, obviously, for obvious reasons, as you mentioned, because Protestantism is kind of a claim for ability to be your own, to understand the world without needing anybody to translate things for you. So, in that regard, yes, but there are, you can define, but Protestantism has many other features that are not liberal, and in that regard, they're not in any way related, kind of, to Judaism. So, and Judaism is a very secular religion. The halacha is...
You have to explain that.
So I will say, because what you could see in halacha reasoning is that those things that in other religions would take, everything that has to do with the relationship to God, for instance, okay? That supposedly need to be given more weight. In Judaism, the priorities are very clear. First and foremost, the life of the individual, okay, his well-being, the dignity of his body, and so on. Only then, okay, there are only three things in the halacha that you must keep, even if the consequences is death, okay? Only three things. All the rest, life takes precedence. So Judaism in its essence, okay, knows what is, what comes before what. The morality of the peace and the well-being and the integrity and the dignity of the human being comes before everything else. And then the big question is, so what happened? I mean, how is it that I need to make this case and people don't say, well, of course. I mean, why is it that the immediate response to this kind of claim is, well, it seems to be entirely, the other way around. And so this is one of my motivations of writing this book, and it has to do with judicial overhaul that's taking place right now, because obviously this is not new. This tension within the Israeli society between Israel being a Jewish and democratic state, and where everybody says, well, in the very opening when I talked about this relationship between these two concepts, when the assumption is, well, there needs to be a balance. It needs to be a democratic and Jewish as well, and how does it work out? And everybody bought into this concept. My claim is this perspective is very modern. It's actually an outcome of a revolt taking place in the 19th century with the wave of secularism, following the Enlightenment and all that, where the ultra-Orthodox were terrified seeing how the Jewish community seemed to be falling apart. Where people, from one day to another stopped keeping the practices of thousands of years, left the community and so on. So in order to put some kind of as a counter fight, they decided that it's time to pick up on some kind of a stance that Judaism got rid of 2,000 years ago and define Judaism in a very different way than the halacha defined.
So is this why Orthodoxy became the standard bearer of Judaism in people's view today? I mean, the fact that your claim is a minority view attests to that, right?
Yeah. So, if I may, look, I'm to be, just to be completely frank, I'm Orthodox as it happens. Okay. But what I say now, I say, and I hope the audience won't be kind of offended. Those who are not Orthodox. I feel part of the issue here is inferior complexion. I think non-Orthodox people are terrified to tell Orthodox people what Judaism is. They submitted entirely to the Orthodox what Judaism is. While Reform Judaism, for instance, represents 4 times, maybe 5 times, maybe 3 times, depends what community, the number of people of the Orthodox community, the default in Israel, and the United States is different, in other places is different, but in Israel, okay, the default Judaism is Orthodox. And then when the Orthodox say, this is what Judaism says, if Smotrich, for instance, says, this is what Judaism says, even if Bibi, right, but Netanyahu says, that's the natural, of course. And then the secular liberals have to define their beliefs contra to what was told them as Judaism. My argument is, reclaim Judaism. That is not what Judaism is. I'll just maybe say, there's not enough time to dive into it, but the distinction is what in those who are more familiar in the rabbinical writing is the difference between Beit Hillel, the house of Hillel, and the house of Shammai. And there was a big question, 2,000 years ago, in Yavne, immediately after the destruction of the temple. There were 2 metaphysical pictures of Judaism to choose out from. The first of which was Beit Hillel, who talked about, renewal, about what I call the liberal stance, putting the person in the center, the rational mind, reason, and so on. Then the counter was Beit Shammai, who was the exact opposite, that talked about tradition, about restriction, about what we call being conservatism. And there was a very explicit ruling saying, Le'olam halacha ke Beit Hillel, v'chol ha'over al Beit Hillel dino mita. Okay, the ruling was, forever, for eternity and beyond, the halakha will always be like the house of Hillel, and whoever challenges the house of Hillel and tries to keep the ruling of Beit Shammai is punished by death. A very, very clear statement of, are you with us or against us? And this ruling was, for 1,800 years. And what happened in the 19th century was
Beit Hillel being more moderate than Beit Shammai, right?
No, Beit Hillel, Judaism was Beit Hillel. Beit Shammai was, dissolved into, you hardly know who Beit Shammai are. If you look they were just disappeared. They were erased out of history. And suddenly, they reappeared in the 19th century. Modern Orthodox today, by and large, is the House of Shammai. Not, what's the irony here? The real counter-revolutionists, the real reform is Orthodox, because they took a ruling from 2,000 years ago and said, no, we're going back to Beit Shammai and not to Beit Hillel. So the reclaim of the Jewish kind of
either reform or fundamentalists. I mean, it's really...
Yeah, no, so I'm saying that's the irony.
Yeah. But there's a reason why it took hold, right? It couldn't be just mere contingency or, merely a response to modernity. I mean, the fact that, this reform or this revolution of the conception of Judaism is so successful to the extent that for people it's really the default setting of Judaism today. I'm trying to maybe to ask you, to analyze the
sociological question.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
No, the power of this revolution. So, why was it so embracing?
So I'll let you know what I think. It's an interesting historical, very complicated historical question, and I'm sure many will answer it differently. But I'll give you my take. I believe, like many things in history, it was a complete consequences. Something, nobody, a wrong turn, turning doors, somebody took the wrong doors. I think the person who took the wrong door was Ben Gurion. Okay, if we try, obviously everything is more complicated, but if we try to nail down like one event, and what was that event? The founding fathers of Israel, Zionism, all came from Orthodox background, as everyone came from Orthodox background, right? 2 or 3 generations back max, right? But most of them came from real Orthodox background. Their parents were rabbis, okay? And they didn't feel any sense of inferiority towards Judaism. They had a new concept of what a Jew is. Zionism was for them the new Judaism. And they didn't feel in any way a need to make the claim to convince anyone. And actually, the Orthodox, the halachic keeping Judaism was the weakest element. Was losing, by the day, the energy, and many people thought it's going to be, entirely disappear in a few generations. The Holocaust, obviously, another very major devastation. And what happened is when Ben Gurion established the country, and the question was, so what is the Jewish identity of this country? I think it was too easy for him to say, well, the Orthodox, claim, and it's important to them. Well, he needed them for all sorts of political reasons. He needed them to be in favor of when the Phil committee was visiting Israel. He needed them, so he had to buy their buy-in. So he was willing to give them because he was assuming it's anyway something so marginal and who cares, and everybody knows what real Judaism is. And what happened is that Israel, Zionism became a new Judaism. It's not real Judaism. It's kind of very thin. And with all due respect to Israeli society, ignorance isn't, the ignorance about Judaism is so much more than it is in diaspora communities. So they didn't know to argue back. So they just felt that this is Judaism. We have to accept. We may not like it, but that's Judaism. We have to accept that it is. And that's where the mistake took place, in my view.
But this is about Israel. But still, it's also, Orthodoxy is really a juggernaut in other places in the world as well. Maybe not the Anglo-American world so much, but in most European countries, mainstream Judaism is Orthodox.
Look, where are the Jews? I mean, the Jews are in North America and in Britain and in France. Okay, so asking what happens in small communities for all sorts of reasons, I think, is misleading and very kind of esoteric, not esoteric, but kind of less. Obviously, you can find all kinds of
negligible, more negligible.
Yeah, exactly. But in North America, not at all. I mean, there's a very sense of pride in the liberal streams of Judaism, no need to apologize. And the truth of the matter is that Orthodox, even people like Rav Soloveitchik, okay, had respect towards difference because they appreciated the nuances. And just in Israel, there's just this dismissiveness of everything that is not Orthodox. Even the secular, feel, kind of are step on the heads of the reform as if they're fake Jews. I mean, that's a crazy thing that's taking place over here.
Yeah. But then again, there's some truth in the Orthodox claim that perhaps a too close espousal of liberalism might lead to the fraying of Judaism. And if you look at demographic trends within American Jewry, we're seeing this over time that, I don't know if it's because of liberalism, but liberal communities, reform communities, as the generation pass, are less and less committed to Judaism.
So my answer to it is this same exact dilemma was facing the Jewish community after the destruction of the temple, between the house of Hillel, Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. And they had to choose, do we take the Judaism to be A or B? And I'm sure the claims of Beit Shammai were exactly the same claims. You guys are crazy. You're going to kill Judaism. You're too liberal, you forget tradition, everything is the human mind, forget about, halakha from Sinai, whatever came back, we can invent halakha, we can use logic principles that came from Greece, you crazy, you reform, you assimilated, and, they look, they kind of weighted probably, the alternatives, and they decided that, if we want to live and survive, well, that's what we need to do. And we need to remember, I just want to give 3 examples in history how remarkable this notion was for a DNA for so many generations, going back to the 6th century BC, okay? Mm-hmm. When Ezra, the scripture, right?
Yeah.
That's probably that's how I should say, Sofer, whatever. So when
Esdras the
scribe, yeah,
right?
when he in the 6th century, when he came back to Jerusalem and and he tried to reconstruct after just only 7 years after the Babylonian exile. And he just realized that people can't read anymore the letters in which the Torah was written. So he took the agent that for 800 years, at least according to tradition, the Torah was written in, Assyrian letters, and the old Hebrew letters, and changed it to Assyrian letters, right? Ktav Ashuri, so people can read it. And the same did the scholars of the Talmud. When Hebrew stopped being the language used, they shifted to Aramaic. So this notion that if you don't adapt, if you don't understand how to make it a religion where that could be something you live, that's a living religion, that's something that people can, prosper with and not need to subject themselves. This is something that is scary, but the decision was made. Yes, of course, there are risks, but it's worth it.
But going back to what you said about Ben Gurion and Zionism in general, so maybe Zionism, I don't know, nationalism, secular nationalism, is that twist of history, is that adaptation of Judaism to modern conditions that allow many people like myself, I'm entirely secular and completely ignorant about all the things that you're talking about, just like any other secular native Israeli, but we have this other, pool of values, if you like, or source of meaning in the world that is separate, but not entirely from our Jewish tradition.
So the question, a way to ask the question, a different question, but makes to the same point, is to say, well, if liberalism is what is important, why be a Jew? I mean, which could be the same. We're all liberals today. Why be Jewish? And it's a good question for different people will answer differently. My claim is to say, look, Zionism alone is not it doesn't have the thickness. It doesn't have this depth that Judaism
gravitas.
Has. No, it is. So the question is, we could ask ourselves, it's perfectly fine to say, like many said, like Aleph Bet Yeshua said, and others said, and many after the Holocaust, there's no reason to be a Jew today. We just need to be part of where we are. So, but if you ask me, part of what we're seeing today in our countries is Zionism doesn't have the foundations in itself to have, to make very clear what the morality of the country is. That's part of the reason what we see today, that we still didn't solve things like, the occupation, we didn't solve things like the state and non-religion.
And there's still a culture war raging.
Exactly. So it's not, I don't think realism is a substitute to Judaism. They speak a very similar language, very, very different. You could be a liberal without being a Jew, without being a religious Jew. But Judaism is more than just believing in God. It has some kind of depth that has a conversation with liberalism, but is more than that. And if we had time, we could speak about what's that added, but I think the motivations are very similar, of freeing the individual and giving him, some kind of a meaning and creating a world of goodness.
Yeah. Well, this kind of Judaism that you're advocating was practiced in recent memory, even in Israel. I'm talking about the previous generation of the religious Zionists, of Mafdal and others, that they were actually a lot more moderate, a lot more liberal, not the kind of fundamentalist sort of religious Zionism that we see now. Yet also, and this I think is not Ben-Gurion's fault in this sense. I mean, they existed even after Ben-Gurion and his entourage defined Israeli Zionist Judaism in a certain way, and they sort of took another version of it. Yet this moderate version, this very kind of Judaism that you're advocating, also petered out and was subsumed by the other more, less tolerant, more violent, fundamentalist sort of Judaism. How do you understand that?
So it's the reasons are those you asked just kind of a minute ago. You asked, are we risking to lose everything if we submit to this kind of a liberal, very inclusive? Where are the borders if everything is inclusive? And that's exactly what happened, I think. Because I think the Orthodox community for many years flirting with this notion of inclusivity, suddenly when nobody accepted Jews, and nobody wanted to marry Jews, and nobody wanted to give Jews jobs. It was very easy to be an inclusive Jew, right? Nobody wanted you, okay? Now, suddenly when emancipation and Jews are accepted and marrying into, the most wealthy and most influential, the Obamas, the Clintons, the Trumps, they are there everywhere, the Ministry of Finance and so on and so forth, right? Suddenly, then it becomes a question, how inclusive Judaism can hold these borders. And I think what happened is the Orthodox had made a decision in Israel. And they thought to themselves, well, given these risks, it's better for us to go back to Beit Shammai. And to counter-revolutionize Judaism and go back to a stance that Beit Hillel, the rabbinic halachic Judaism, already pushed back and erased. And to say, no. God, going back to all the old system of beliefs. So yeah, it's a risk. The question is the risk worth taking. I definitely live my life and raise my children under this assumption that it's absolutely a risk worth taking.
Right. Okay. Dr. Shiva Greenfield, the author of the new book, Judaism and Liberalism, A Metaphysical Tale of Two Siblings. Thank you very much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure.
And many thanks to Itai Shelem, the manager of TLV1 Studios. And now we've got a request, because many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we'd like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. Good, bad, ugly, up to you. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has way more than 800 interviews. Like us on Facebook. Follow me on Twitter. Yael and my co-host will be back next week. And then join us for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from me here in Tel Aviv, goodbye.